Porcelain didn't shatter this time. Voices did. The elevator doors hadn't even closed before the shouting began. Two nannies, barely 3 weeks into their positions, stood in the marble lobby of Chicago's Pierce Tower screaming at Mrs. Langford, the head of staff. Their words echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. "That boy is impossible. He doesn't listen to anything. I didn't sign up to be assaulted by a child who refuses to communicate." Mrs. Langford's expression remained carved from ice as she signed their exit papers with sharp, efficient strokes. The elevator swallowed them whole, leaving only the ghost of their anger hanging in the air. 9 stories above, 9-year-old Jordan Pierce sat on the polished hardwood floor of his bedroom, hands moving in sharp, rhythmic patterns that no one in the penthouse could understand. His fingers formed shapes, questions, desperate pleas, all met with blank stares and frustrated sighs. To everyone who worked in Donovan Pierce's lakefront palace, Jordan was a problem without a solution. Volatile, erratic, unreachable. To his father, the boy was something worse. A constant reminder that even a billion-dollar fortune couldn't fix everything. Donovan Pierce had built an empire on solving impossible problems. His tech company revolutionized cybersecurity, made him the 3rd richest man in Illinois, earned him features in Forbes and invitations to the White House. But he couldn't solve his own son. Specialists from New York Presbyterian, therapists from Toronto's Sick Kids, behaviorists from San Diego, all had cycled through, all had quit. And with each departure, Jordan's silence grew heavier, like fog settling over the penthouse until no one could see him clearly anymore. Enter Mariah Carter. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, stepping off the red line at Chicago Avenue with a worn duffel bag and a quiet determination. The cleaning agency had promised good pay, steady hours, and discretion. Mariah needed all 3. Her teenage brother, Marcus, was depending on her to keep the lights on in their uptown apartment after their mother passed 6 months earlier. What the agency didn't mention was the rules. Mrs. Langford delivered them in the service entrance, her voice clipped and precise. "You will clean. You will not speak unless spoken to, and you will absolutely not engage with the boy." Her pale eyes narrowed. "He doesn't listen, and he doesn't understand." Previous staff made the mistake of trying to help. "They're no longer employed here." Mariah simply nodded, eyes down, hands folded. She'd learned long ago that some employers wanted maids who stayed invisible. But she'd already noticed him, the small boy sitting cross-legged near the window, hands tapping deliberate patterns on his thighs. Not tantrums, not randomness, something purposeful. When Jordan looked up and their eyes met, he tilted his head. Then he tapped twice on the floor, sharp, intentional, like Morse code only he understood. Mariah's grandmother had been deaf, had taught her basic signs before she passed. So when Mariah's hands moved almost instinctively, forming the simple gesture for friend, she watched Jordan's entire world crack open. His brown eyes widened, his breath caught, his hands started to move in response. Then Mrs. Langford's heels clicked into the hallway, and the moment shattered. But the connection did not. The Pierce penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor of Chicago's newest glass tower, a monument to wealth perched above Michigan Avenue like a crown. From the floor-to-ceiling windows, you could see Navy Pier, the shimmer of Lake Michigan stretching toward infinity, and the architectural canyon of downtown, a view that cost more per month than most people earned in a year. Inside, everything gleamed. Marble imported from Carrara, furniture from Milan, art that required its own insurance policy. But despite all that beauty, despite all that perfection, the space felt suffocating, like a museum where nothing was allowed to be touched, broken, or truly alive. Mariah spent her first 3 days learning the rhythms of the household. She arrived at 6 in the morning through the service entrance, changed into her uniform in the staff quarters, and received her assignments from Mrs. Langford, who ran the Pierce household with military precision. The head of staff was a white woman in her late 50s, always dressed in severe black suits, her silver hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to cause her permanent discomfort. "The West Wing first," Mrs. Langford would say, handing Mariah a clipboard. "Then the kitchen. Mr. Pierce's office is off-limits unless specifically requested, and remember, don't engage with Jordan," Mariah would finish quietly. Mrs. Langford's thin lips would press together in approval before she walked away, heels clicking like a metronome. But Mariah couldn't help watching the boy. Jordan moved through the penthouse like a ghost, present but unseen. He'd sit in the library with books spread before him, though no one read to him. He'd stand by the windows, hands pressed against the glass, staring at a city he could see but not hear. And his hands, God, his hands never stopped moving. They'd flutter near his chest, form shapes, try to communicate something urgent. But everyone around him treated those movements like static, like interference to be ignored. Mariah recognized the signs immediately. Incomplete ASL, self-taught fragments. The desperate body language of a child drowning in silence while surrounded by people who refused to throw him a rope. She'd seen it before, years ago in Atlanta, when she volunteered at the Martin Luther King Jr. Community Center as an interpreter for deaf students. Kids whose parents couldn't afford specialists, whose schools didn't have resources, who'd invented their own hybrid sign language just to survive. Mariah had spent 3 years helping bridge that gap, translating not just words, but entire worlds. Then her mother got sick. The medical bills piled up. The volunteer work had to stop. Mariah took on double shifts at the restaurant, then triple. When her mother finally passed, Mariah found herself with a grieving 16-year-old brother, a mountain of debt, and a desperate need to start over somewhere new. Chicago had promised opportunity. But standing in this golden cage, watching a child suffocate in silence while his billionaire father hosted conference calls in the next room, Mariah wondered what kind of opportunity required her to turn away from suffering. On her 4th day, she saw it happen. Donovan Pierce came home early from his downtown office, his presence announced by the entire staff straightening their postures. He was tall, mid-40s, with the kind of sharp features that looked good on magazine covers. His suit probably cost more than Mariah's monthly rent. He moved through his own home like he was still in a boardroom. Efficient, distracted, already mentally 3 meetings ahead. "Jordan," he called from the foyer, not even looking up from his phone. "Come here." The boy appeared from the library, walking slowly, his small hands clasped in front of him. "I need you to behave tonight," Donovan said, still typing on his phone. "I have investors coming for dinner. Can you do that?" Jordan's hands started moving, signing something urgent, something desperate. His father didn't even glance up. "I asked you a question, son. Can you behave?" Jordan signed more frantically. Mariah, standing frozen in the hallway with a laundry basket, felt her chest tighten. The boy was saying, "I'm trying," over and over, his face contorting with the effort of being understood. Donovan finally looked up, irritation creasing his forehead. "Stop that. Stop making those gestures. We've been over this. If you want something, use your words." Jordan's hands dropped. His whole body seemed to collapse inward. "Go to your room," Donovan said, already turning away. "I'll have someone bring you dinner." Jordan walked past Mariah without seeing her, shoulders hunched. A child, folding himself smaller and smaller until maybe he'd disappear entirely. That night, Mariah lay awake in her small apartment in Uptown, staring at the water-stained ceiling. Her brother Marcus was asleep in the next room, and she could hear the distant rumble of the L train passing on the tracks above Lawrence Avenue. She kept replaying Jordan's signs, his father's dismissal, the way the boy's face had crumpled. She thought about her promise to her grandmother. Never stop listening, even when the world does. But listening here meant losing the job that kept her and Marcus housed. Listening here meant crossing Mrs. Langford, defying household rules, risking everything she'd come to Chicago to build. Mariah closed her eyes. Then she made her decision. Tomorrow, she would start listening. And whatever consequences followed, she'd face them standing up rather than kneeling in complicit silence. Because some things were more important than safety. Some voices couldn't afford to wait. Mrs. Langford ran the Pierce household like a kingdom, and she was its unforgiving queen. There were rules, so many rules they could fill a binder, and in fact, they did. Mariah had been given a leather-bound manual on her first day, 43 pages of protocols covering everything from which cleaning products to use on which surfaces to the exact way Mr. Pierce preferred his morning coffee arranged on his desk. But the unwritten rules were the ones that mattered most. Rule 1. Staff were invisible. Present when needed. Absent when not. Never drawing attention to themselves in any capacity. Rule 2. Information stayed in the household. Whatever you saw, whatever you heard, you took to your grave or at least to your next job interview, preferably years later. Rule 3. Do not engage with Jordan Pierce. Mrs. Langford had made this abundantly clear during Mariah's orientation, leading her through the penthouse's west wing with the mechanical precision of a prison guard giving a facility tour. The previous cleaning staff made the mistake of believing they could help the child, Mrs. Langford had said, her voice flat. They attempted to communicate with him, to interpret his behaviors, to act as intermediaries with Mr. Pierce. It was inappropriate, unprofessional, and ultimately unsuccessful. She'd stopped before Jordan's bedroom door, her hand resting on the doorknob. The boy has been evaluated by the finest specialists in the country. They've determined that his behaviors are attention-seeking, that his hand movements are self-stimulation, and that engaging with these behaviors only reinforces them. Your job is to clean, not to parent, not to diagnose, not to interfere. Mariah had nodded, keeping her face carefully neutral. But inside, her stomach had turned. She'd heard this language before, this clinical detachment that treated struggling children like malfunctioning machines. It was the same language that had almost destroyed her grandmother's spirit decades ago, before the deaf community fought back and demanded recognition as a culture, not a disability. Now, 2 weeks into her employment, Mariah moved through the penthouse with quiet efficiency, while her mind catalogued everything the official story left out. Jordan wasn't attention-seeking. He was communicating. His hand movements weren't random stimulation. They were incomplete signs, fragments of ASL mixed with home signs he'd created himself, a private language born from desperate isolation. And the reason previous staff had failed wasn't because they'd interfered. It was because they'd tried to help without actually understanding what the child needed. Mariah watched him during her morning cleaning routines. Jordan would sit in the sunroom surrounded by educational toys no one had taught him to use, his fingers tracing patterns on the windowsill. Tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Each rhythm different, each pattern deliberate. He was counting, she realized. Counting something the rest of them couldn't hear. She watched him during lunch, when Maria the cook would set his plate on the dining table and walk away without making eye contact. Jordan would sit alone in that massive room designed for entertaining dozens, a small boy surrounded by empty chairs. His hands would move through signs before each bite. Thank you, please, help. Muscle memory from some distant past when maybe someone had tried to teach him. She watched him in the evenings when his father would come home and immediately disappear into his office. Jordan would stand outside that closed door for 5, 10, sometimes 15 minutes, his small hand hovering near the wood, working up the courage to knock. He never did. And Mariah watched the staff, the way they'd physically turn away when Jordan entered a room, the way they'd speak over him or around him but never to him, the way Mrs. Langford's eyes would narrow with barely concealed disdain whenever the child came into view. It wasn't just neglect. It was systematic erasure. On a Thursday afternoon, Mariah was cleaning the second-floor library when she found the photo albums. They were tucked on a high shelf, leather-bound books that looked hand-assembled. She shouldn't have looked. It wasn't her business, wasn't part of her assigned duties. But when she pulled the first album down to dust behind it, the cover fell open. A woman smiled back at her from a photograph, golden-haired and radiant, holding a newborn wrapped in blue. The caption beneath read, "Sarah and Jordan, first day home." Mariah turned the pages slowly. Sarah Pierce appeared in photograph after photograph, laughing in Lincoln Park, dancing with toddler Jordan at what looked like a backyard party, teaching him to blow out birthday candles, signing "I love you" with her hands, while Jordan, maybe 3 years old, mimicked the gesture back. The woman knew sign language. More photographs. Sarah and Jordan at the shed aquarium, both making the sign for fish. Sarah and Jordan in the penthouse, building block towers, her hands forming shapes while he watched intently. Sarah at a deaf community event, Jordan in her arms surrounded by signers. The last photograph in the album was dated 3 years ago. Sarah in a hospital bed, painfully thin, her beautiful hair gone. Jordan sat beside her, now 6 years old, his small hands spelling out letters on her palm while tears ran down both their faces. The next page was a funeral program. Mariah's hands trembled as she closed the album. Jordan's mother had been teaching him ASL, had been raising him bilingual, connected to deaf culture, and when she died, that entire world had been cut away from him like a limb. No wonder he was drowning. He'd lost not just his mother but his language, his community, his ability to be understood. "What are you doing?" Mariah jumped. Mrs. Langford stood in the library doorway, her face carved from ice. I was dusting, ma'am. The album fell." "Put it back." Mariah carefully returned the album to its shelf, her heart hammering. Mrs. Langford entered the room slowly, her heels making sharp sounds against the hardwood. "Those albums are not to be touched. Mrs. Pierce's belongings are sensitive." "Yes, ma'am. I apologize." Mrs. Pierce had ideas about how to raise the child. Mrs. Langford continued, her voice taking on a bitter edge. She believed in indulging his behaviors, encouraging those hand gestures, treating his condition as if it were something to be celebrated rather than corrected. Mariah kept her eyes down, but her jaw clenched. Mr. Pierce understands now that those methods were unsuccessful. The boy's condition worsened under his mother's approach. He became more withdrawn, more dependent on those gestures, less able to function in the real world. Mr. Pierce has invested considerable resources in helping Jordan overcome these learned behaviors and develop appropriate communication skills. Translation: Donovan Pierce was trying to erase his dead wife's influence and force his son to be normal. "Do you understand, Miss Carter?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Langford studied her for a long moment. "I hope so. The previous cleaning staff developed inappropriate emotional attachments." They believed they knew better than trained specialists. It didn't end well for them, and it certainly didn't help the child. She turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. Mr. Pierce is hosting a fundraiser this weekend. 200 guests on the rooftop terrace. I'll need you to work overtime. Can you do that without complications? Mariah met her eyes. Yes, ma'am. After Mrs. Langford left, Mariah stood alone in the library, her hands gripping the dustcloth so tightly her knuckles ached. Through the window, she could see Lake Michigan stretching toward the horizon, boats moving across water that looked cold and dark from this height. That night, after her shift ended, Mariah rode the Red Line north toward Uptown. The train was crowded with evening commuters, everyone lost in their phones or books or exhausted stares. She pulled out her own phone and searched for Pierce family, Sarah Pierce death. The obituary appeared immediately. Sarah Monroe Pierce, age 38, beloved wife and mother, active in the Chicago deaf community, board member of several ASL advocacy organizations, died after a 2-year battle with breast cancer. Mariah scrolled through dozens of articles, glowing tributes from deaf community leaders, heartbreaking photos from her memorial service, and then, buried in a Chicago Tribune profile from a year ago, a quote from Donovan Pierce himself. My wife believed in a different approach to our son's development. I respected her wishes while she was alive. Now I'm focused on what I believe is best for Jordan's future, helping him integrate into the hearing world, rather than separating him from it. Mariah's stomach turned. She clicked on another link, this one a blog post from a deaf advocate titled When Hearing Parents Erase Deaf Identity. Donovan Pierce's recent interview signals a disturbing trend among wealthy hearing parents who view deafness as a problem to be solved, rather than an identity to be supported. By removing ASL from his son's life and rejecting the community his late wife worked so hard to build, Pierce is isolating Jordan from the very tools that would help him thrive. Money can buy many things, but it cannot buy belonging. And that may be the most tragic part of this story. The train lurched around a curve. Mariah gripped her phone, reading and rereading those words, until her stop at Argyle. When she walked into her apartment, Marcus was at the kitchen table doing homework, his headphones in, completely absorbed. He looked up when she entered and smiled, her sweet baby brother, all gangly teenage limbs and optimism. Hey, Raya. There's leftover pizza in the fridge if you're hungry. She kissed the top of his head. Already ate, baby. How was school? Good. I think I actually understood chemistry today. Miracles do happen. Mariah laughed, the sound surprising her. That is a miracle. She retreated to her tiny bedroom and sat on the bed, her phone still clutched in her hand. Through the thin walls, she could hear their neighbor's television, someone laughing at a sitcom. Normal life, uncomplicated. But all she could see was Jordan's face, the way his hands moved through signs no one acknowledged, the way he'd stood outside his father's office like a ghost begging to be seen. The rooftop fundraiser was in 3 days. 200 guests. Mrs. Langford would be distracted. The security protocols would be focused on external threats, not internal ones. If Mariah was going to do something, that would be the moment. She thought about her grandmother's weathered hands forming signs in the sunlight streaming through their Atlanta kitchen. Thought about her little brother Samuel, dead at 15 because poverty meant delayed treatment and second-rate care. Thought about every child she'd interpreted for at the community center, their faces lighting up when finally, someone understood. Then she thought about losing this job, losing the income that kept Marcus in school, losing the apartment, losing everything she'd fought for since their mother died. The smart choice was obvious. Keep her head down, follow the rules, survive. but Mariah had never been very good at watching children suffer in silence. Jordan first sought her out on a Wednesday morning. Mariah was polishing the marble island in the kitchen, her reflection warping across the glossy surface, when she felt eyes on her back. She turned and found him standing in the doorway, small, hesitant, his brown hair falling across his forehead. He stood there for a long moment, hands clasped in front of him. Then, very deliberately, he raised his right hand and tapped his chin twice with his fingertips before pointing toward her. Mariah's breath caught. It was the sign for you, modified with a questioning gesture. He was asking if she understood. She glanced toward the hallway. No one in sight. Maria had gone to the store. Mrs. Langford was in Mr. Pierce's office reviewing household accounts. They were alone. Mariah set down her cloth and turned fully toward Jordan. Then she raised her hand and signed back. "Yes, I understand." The transformation in his face was instant, like watching sun break through storm clouds. His whole body seemed to unfold, and suddenly his hands were moving faster, signing rapid-fire fragments. "You see me, can talk. No one sees. They don't." He paused, struggling for a sign, then fingerspelled clumsily, Listen. Mariah's eyes burned. She signed slowly, clearly. "I see you. I listen." Jordan's hands trembled as he signed back. "Are you real?" The question hit her like a punch. How long had this child been surrounded by people, drowning in isolation, wondering if anyone could actually perceive him? "I'm real," she signed. "I'm here." He took a step closer, then another, and before Mariah could react, he'd wrapped his thin arms around her waist, his face pressed against her apron. His whole body shook with silent sobs, years of loneliness pouring out all at once. Mariah knelt down and hugged him back, one hand rubbing gentle circles on his back. She didn't sign. Didn't need to. Sometimes presence was its own language. When he finally pulled away, his face was blotchy and wet, but his eyes held something that hadn't been there before. Hope. He signed frantically. "Can you teach me more signs? I forget, Mom taught me, but she—" His hands stumbled, and instead of finishing, he made a motion Mariah recognized from deaf culture. The sign for someone passing away, hands rising like a soul leaving the body. "I can teach you," Mariah signed back. "But it has to be secret. Do you understand? If they know, I have to leave." Jordan nodded vigorously, his hands already forming the sign for secret, both hands at his lips, then moving away in a locking motion. His mother had taught him well, even if time and isolation had eroded most of what he'd learned. Over the next 2 weeks, they developed a system. When Mrs. Langford was occupied, when Maria was in the basement laundry room, when the household's carefully orchestrated routines created pockets of unwatched time, Mariah and Jordan would find each other. In the library, she'd dust while he pretended to read, and she'd sign vocabulary into the space between them. Colors, foods, emotions. Happy was both hands at the chest, brushing upward. Sad was both hands moving down the face. Angry was fingers bent like claws, pulling away from the face. Jordan absorbed everything like parched earth soaking up rain. In the sunroom, while Mariah cleaned windows, Jordan would practice fingerspelling the alphabet, his small fingers forming letters with increasing confidence. She'd correct his hand shapes gently, encouraging him when he got frustrated, celebrating when he successfully spelled entire words. In the hallways, they'd developed the emergency signal. If Jordan saw her and tapped his wrist twice, it meant not safe. If she tapped her shoulder, it meant later, I promise. And slowly, painfully, Jordan began to emerge from his silence. He smiled more, stood straighter, started initiating their secret lessons instead of passively waiting. His signs grew more confident, more complex. He began combining signs into simple sentences. I want to learn more. Thank you for helping me. I'm not alone anymore. But their stolen moments also revealed darker truths. One afternoon, while Mrs. Langford was at a doctor's appointment and the household was minimally staffed, Jordan appeared in the guest bedroom Mariah was cleaning. His face was pale, his hands shaking. He signed, I need tell you something. What's wrong? Mariah signed back, immediately setting aside her vacuum. Jordan glanced toward the door, then back. His hands moved slowly, carefully, forming signs for concepts he barely had language for. The doctor, Dad's doctor, they do things. What things? Mariah felt ice forming in her chest. Jordan's face contorted. He touched his head, his ears, then made a gesture Mariah didn't recognize, hands pressing inward on either side of his skull. Make it quiet, more quiet. They say it helps, but it hurts. Mariah's hands froze halfway through a response. They hurt you? Not? Jordan struggled, frustrated with his limited vocabulary. He fingerspelled Medicine, then machines, then everything far away. Mariah's medical knowledge was limited, but she'd heard stories from the deaf community. Stories about unethical practitioners who promised to cure deafness through experimental treatments. Cochlear implants forced on unwilling children. Behavioral modification therapies that traumatized instead of helped. She'd always hoped those stories were exaggerations. When? She signed. How often? Every Tuesday, Jordan signed. Dad says I'm getting better. But His hands dropped. He didn't have signs for what he wanted to express, so instead he just looked at her with eyes that held too much knowledge for a 9-year-old. Before Mariah could respond, they heard Mrs. Langford's distinctive heel clicks in the hallway below. Jordan's eyes went wide. He signed secret frantically and bolted from the room. Mariah returned to her vacuuming, her mind racing. Tuesday treatments, unauthorized procedures, a father who believed he was helping but might actually be harming. She needed more information. She needed proof. That evening, after her shift, she stopped at the Chicago Public Library on her way to the Red Line. The librarian helped her access medical databases, research journals, articles about deaf children and experimental treatments. What she found made her stomach turn. There were documented cases of wealthy parents subjecting deaf children to dangerous experimental procedures, electromagnetic therapy that promised to stimulate auditory nerves, medications that caused severe side effects, behavioral modification programs that traumatized children under the guise of helping them adapt to the hearing world. And there were no regulations preventing it. If you had enough money, enough connections, enough desperation, you could subject your child to almost anything, as long as you framed it as medical treatment. Mariah rode the Red Line home in a daze. Through the window, Chicago's nighttime skyline glittered. All those buildings filled with people living their lives, completely unaware of the small boy trapped in a glass tower, being hurt in the name of help. When she got home, Marcus was asleep on the couch, economics textbook open on his chest. She covered him with a blanket and sat at their tiny kitchen table, her phone in her hands. She should call someone. Child Protective Services, a lawyer, the police. But who would believe her? A maid with no proof beyond a child's limited sign language, against a billionaire with a team of lawyers and carefully curated medical documentation. She thought about the previous cleaning staff Mrs. Langford had mentioned, the ones who'd inappropriately interfered and were subsequently fired. Had they seen what Mariah was seeing? Had they tried to help? And where were they now? Mariah looked up, Donovan Pierce lawsuit cleaning staff, but found nothing. She tried Pierce household wrongful termination and came up empty. Either those staff members had signed NDAs, or they'd been silenced through other means. The rooftop fundraiser was in 3 days. 200 of Chicago's elite, all focused on Donovan Pierce's latest philanthropic venture. Cameras, media, witnesses. If something happened there, something public enough that it couldn't be covered up, dramatic enough that it couldn't be ignored, then maybe, just maybe, Jordan's truth could finally be heard. But the risk was astronomical. Mariah would lose her job immediately, might face legal consequences, would definitely sacrifice the stability she'd fought so hard to build for Marcus. Her phone buzzed. A text from the temp agency. Pierce household requesting you work Saturday gala. Time and a half. Interested? Time and a half. That would cover Marcus's school fees for next semester. Mariah stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed back, yes. 3 days. She had 3 days to figure out how to save a child without destroying herself in the process. The house built on silence was about to learn that some voices refused to be buried. Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect weather that Chicago only offers a few times each year. Warm sunshine, gentle breeze, lake sparkling like scattered diamonds. The kind of day that made locals forget the brutal winters and tourists understand why the city was called the crown jewel of the Midwest. For the Pierce household, it was showtime. The rooftop terrace had been transformed overnight into something from a magazine spread. White linen covered 40 tables arranged in perfect symmetry. Crystal centerpieces caught the sunlight and threw rainbow refractions across the space. A string quartet occupied one corner, their instruments gleaming. At the far end, a full bar staffed by mixologists who'd trained at the French Laundry. Everything designed to whisper wealth without ever having to shout it. Mariah arrived at noon, entering through the service entrance alongside 10 other temporary staff hired specifically for the event. Mrs. Langford stood in the kitchen like a general preparing troops for battle, clipboard in hand, her severe bun pulled even tighter than usual. You will circulate with appetizers, she instructed the group. You will not speak unless addressed. You will not linger near conversations. You will be invisible. Is that understood? A chorus of, yes, ma'am, echoed back. Mrs. Langford's eyes found Mariah. Miss Carter, you'll be stationed at the north side of the terrace. That section is farthest from Mr. Pierce's main presentation area, which means it requires the most attention to detail. I'm trusting you to handle it professionally. Translation. You're being kept as far from Donovan Pierce as possible. Yes, ma'am, Mariah said evenly. By 2 o'clock, guests began arriving. They emerged from the private elevator in designer gowns and tailored suits, Chicago's tech elite, venture capitalists, politicians, and society figures whose names regularly appeared in the Tribune's social pages. The women wore jewelry that could fund small countries. The men wore confidence like cologne. They air-kissed and networked, sipped champagne and nibbled on foie gras, all while pretending the servers moving among them were furniture. Mariah circulated with a tray of canapes, her face a professional mask. But her eyes were searching, constantly searching, for Jordan. She found him at 3 o'clock, seated at a small table near the presentation stage. He wore a tailored navy blazer and looked profoundly uncomfortable, his small hands folded tightly in his lap. Donovan Pierce stood nearby, working the crowd with the ease of someone who'd spent decades in boardrooms and ballrooms. Jordan's eyes met Mariah's across the terrace. She saw the plea there, the desperation of a child being displayed like a prop. She signed quickly, discreetly behind her tray. Okay? He signed back, equally hidden. Scared. Breathe, she signed. I'm here. A small, grateful smile flickered across his face. At 3:30, Donovan Pierce took the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. His voice carried across the terrace, warm and practiced. As many of you know, my wife Sarah passed 3 years ago. She was passionate about education, about giving every child the opportunity to reach their full potential. So today, I'm honored to announce the Sarah Pierce Foundation for Child Development, a $50 million initiative focused on early intervention programs for children facing developmental challenges. Applause rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Jordan sat frozen in his chair, staring at his lap. My own son has taught me so much about the importance of perseverance, of never giving up on a child's potential. Jordan, would you stand up, buddy? Every head turned toward the small boy. Jordan slowly rose, his face pale, his hands trembling. More applause, more cameras. Mariah watched from her position near the bar, her chest tight. We can overcome any obstacle with the right support, the right interventions, and the right commitment, Donovan continued, his hand on Jordan's shoulder. That's what this foundation represents. Thank you all for being here. The crowd erupted in louder applause. Then, on cue, the string quartet launched into their first number. That's when everything shattered. The music hit like a physical force, violins screaming into the afternoon, the first note so loud and sharp and unexpected that several guests actually flinched. But Jordan didn't flinch. He convulsed. His hands flew to his ears, pressing hard against the sides of his head. His mouth opened in a silent scream. His whole body began rocking violently back and forth, an instinctive response to sensory overload that his damaged hearing was processing as unbearable pain. The guests closest to him stepped back, confused. The quartet, not understanding, played louder. Jordan dropped to his knees. "Jordan," Donovan hissed, leaning down. "Stop this. Get up. People are watching." But Jordan couldn't hear him. Couldn't hear anything except the overwhelming assault of sound his father had orchestrated, without once considering how it would affect his son. The boy's hands moved frantically, signing things Mariah recognized even from across the terrace. "Stop! Hurts! Please! Stop! Stop! Stop!" The crowd was murmuring now. Cameras were repositioning, capturing everything. This wasn't the inspirational moment Donovan had choreographed. This was a crisis unfolding in front of 200 witnesses. Mrs. Langford materialized beside Donovan, bending close to whisper urgently. 2 security staff appeared, moving toward Jordan as if to physically remove him from view. Mariah made her choice. She dropped her tray, canapes scattering across the terrace, and ran. "Miss Carter!" Mrs. Langford's voice cracked like a whip, but Mariah ignored it. She pushed through the crowd, not caring about protocol or consequences or anything except reaching that small boy who was drowning in front of everyone. She dropped to her knees beside Jordan, placing herself between him and the security staff. "You're safe," she signed rapidly, her hands moving in his line of sight. "Breathe. With me. In. Out. Look at my hands. You're safe." Jordan's wild eyes found hers. His rocking slowed fractionally. "Watch me," she signed. "Breathe. In." She demonstrated, her chest rising. "Out." Her chest falling. Jordan tried to match her rhythm, his small body still trembling but beginning to stabilize. The entire terrace had gone silent too. Even the quartet had stopped playing, their bows frozen mid-air. Mariah kept signing, kept breathing, kept her focus entirely on Jordan. "You're safe. I'm here. You're not alone. Breathe with me." Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds, Jordan's breathing began to regulate. His hands lowered from his ears. He collapsed forward into Mariah's arms, his face buried in her shoulder. She held him, one hand rubbing circles on his back, while 200 of Chicago's most powerful people watched in stunned silence. Then Donovan Pierce spoke, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "Get your hands off my son." Mariah looked up. Donovan's face was crimson. His jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles jumping. "Get up, Miss Carter. You're fired. Security will escort you out immediately." "Mr. Pierce," Mariah started. "Now!" Jordan's hands clutched at her uniform, signing desperately against her shoulder. "Don't go. Please, don't leave me." Mariah's eyes burned, but she gently disentangled herself and stood. 2 security guards flanked her, their hands hovering near her arms. As they led her toward the elevator, she looked back once. Jordan stood alone beside his father, tears streaming down his face, his hands signing one phrase over and over. "Help me. They're hurting me. Help me." Mariah's blood turned to ice. That phrase, those signs, the same ones she'd been seeing for weeks, always dismissed as childish acting out. But now, in front of witnesses in clear daylight, with cameras capturing everything, she could see the full context. Jordan wasn't being dramatic. He was testifying. The elevator doors opened. The security guards ushered her inside. As the doors slid closed, Mariah met Mrs. Langford's eyes across the terrace. The older woman's expression was pure venom. But Mariah didn't look away, because she'd just seen something Mrs. Langford clearly hadn't noticed, something that was going to change everything. 3 guests near the bar had been filming on their phones. The whole meltdown, the signing, everything. And one of those guests was Rebecca Morrison, investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune, known for her exposés on wealthy families hiding dark secrets. The elevator descended, carrying Mariah away from the rooftop, away from the glittering disaster, away from the only job that had kept her and Marcus afloat. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and typed a single text to Rebecca Morrison's public Twitter. "The boy is signing. They're hurting me. Do you understand what you just filmed?" Then she pressed send and waited for her entire world to explode. The Red Line train rattled north through Chicago's evening streets, carrying Mariah toward uptown and an uncertain future. Around her, passengers scrolled through phones or stared out windows, everyone cocooned in their private worlds, unaware that the well-dressed black woman in the corner was replaying the worst hour of her life on an endless loop. Jordan's face as she walked away, his frantic hands signing "Help me." Donovan Pierce's cold fury, Mrs. Langford's triumph, the security guard's firm grip on her arms as they escorted her not just off the roof, but through the entire building. Out the service entrance, onto Michigan Avenue like trash being taken out. She'd been given 15 minutes to collect her belongings from the staff locker. Her worn backpack, her spare shoes, a photograph of Marcus she kept pinned inside the door. Then she'd been handed a severance check for 2 weeks' pay, and an NDA that the Pierce attorney, materializing with supernatural speed, had insisted she sign before leaving the premises. Mariah had signed it. What choice did she have? Fight a billionaire's legal team while unemployed? But signing the NDA meant she couldn't go public with what she knew, couldn't contact media, couldn't even discuss the Pierce household with anyone except in the vaguest terms. The train lurched around a curve. Mariah's phone buzzed. 3 missed calls from Marcus. 2 texts. "Where are you?" And, "Raya, you okay?" "You sound weird in your voicemail." She'd called him right after leaving the building, her voice shaking, trying to explain she'd lost her job but everything would be okay. She'd lied, of course. Nothing was okay. Her phone buzzed again. This time, an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her swipe to accept. "Is this Mariah Carter?" A woman's voice, professional and urgent. "Who is this?" "Rebecca Morrison, Chicago Tribune. I got your message. Can we talk?" Mariah's heart hammered. "I signed an NDA. I'm not asking you to violate it, but what I saw today, That child signing. I need to understand what happened. You clearly know sign language. You were helping him. I have footage from 3 different angles. This is news, Miss Carter. Real news. Mariah closed her eyes. I can't talk about the Pierce household. Then don't. Talk about deaf children in general. Talk about what those hand movements mean. Help me understand the context without violating your agreement. The train was pulling into the Argyle stop. Mariah's stop. She gathered her backpack and stood. There's a coffee shop on Argyle and Sheridan, she said quietly. I'll be there in 10 minutes. I'll be there in 20. The call ended. Mariah stepped onto the platform and immediately felt the weight of what she'd just agreed to. Meeting with a journalist after signing an NDA was legal suicide. But maybe if she was careful, if she spoke only in generalities, if she helped Rebecca understand what Jordan had been trying to communicate without explicitly naming him, maybe that could be enough to plant a seed. The coffee shop was called Collective Grounds, a neighborhood staple that roasted its own beans and hosted open mic nights on Thursdays. Mariah ordered chamomile tea she couldn't afford and sat at a corner table, her hands wrapped around the warm cup. Rebecca Morrison arrived exactly 20 minutes later, a white woman in her 40s, short salt and pepper hair, wearing jeans and a blazer that had seen better days. She carried a worn leather messenger bag and the kind of purposeful energy that made Mariah understand why she'd won 3 Illinois Press Association awards. Miss Carter? She extended her hand. Thank you for meeting me. They shook. Rebecca ordered black coffee and sat down across from Mariah. I'm going to be direct, Rebecca said, pulling out a tablet. I attended the Pierce fundraiser today as press. I watched a 9-year-old boy have what appeared to be a severe panic attack in front of 200 people. I watched you, a member of the household staff, run to help him using sign language. And I watched Donovan Pierce fire you on the spot for doing so. She turned the tablet toward Mariah. On the screen, a video frozen on Jordan's face, his hands mid-sign, his expression anguished. I've spent the last 3 hours consulting with ASL experts, including a professor at Columbia College Chicago's ASL program. They watched this footage and all agreed. That child is signing, help me, they're hurting me. Is that correct? Mariah's throat closed. I can't. You don't have to confirm anything about the Pierce household specifically, but as someone who clearly knows ASL, can you tell me what those hand movements typically mean in deaf communication? Carefully, Mariah said, those hand positions, in general ASL, would indicate distress, a plea for assistance. The specific combination of signs you showed me would typically translate to something like, help me, I'm being hurt, or in pain. Rebecca's expression hardened. And how common is it for deaf children to make those signs in non-emergency situations? As, say, attention-seeking behavior. It's not common at all. Deaf children don't casually sign about being hurt. Sign language is direct, honest. When a deaf child signs pain or fear, it's because they're experiencing pain or fear. Rebecca made notes on her tablet. I've been doing background research on the Pierce family. Sarah Pierce, Donovan's late wife, was heavily involved in Chicago's deaf community. She served on the board of several ASL advocacy organizations. But after her death 3 years ago, Donovan Pierce seems to have completely cut ties with those communities. Why would a parent do that? Mariah chose her words carefully. Sometimes hearing parents of deaf children believe that deafness is a problem to be solved rather than an identity to be supported. When those parents have resources, money, access to experimental treatments, they might pursue interventions that the deaf community would consider harmful. What kind of interventions? Behavioral modification, medication that promises to improve auditory processing but often has severe side effects, pressure to suppress sign language and focus exclusively on speech therapy. In extreme cases, Mariah's voice caught. In extreme cases, unlicensed treatments that traumatize children under the guise of helping them. Rebecca's pen had stopped moving. Are you saying you believe Jordan Pierce is being subjected to harmful treatments? I can't comment on any specific child or household. But hypothetically, if I saw a deaf child who had clearly been taught sign language but was now prevented from using it, whose father spoke about overcoming obstacles and never giving up in the context of that child's deafness, I would be very concerned about what methods were being used in the name of help. They sat in silence for a moment. The coffee shop's Saturday evening crowd hummed around them. College students studying, couples on dates, people living normal lives. Rebecca leaned forward. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm writing a feature article about deaf children in wealthy families, focusing on how some parents pursue harmful cures instead of acceptance. I'll interview ASL experts, deaf advocates, child psychologists. I won't mention the Pierce family by name unless I can find corroborating evidence beyond what I filmed today. She pulled up another video on her tablet. But I will publish these clips with faces blurred as examples of deaf children in distress. And if that happens to generate public interest, if that happens to prompt authorities to ask questions about specific families, well, that's not something I can control. Mariah's eyes burned. His name is Jordan. He's 9 years old. He lost his mother 3 years ago, and with her, he lost the only person who ever understood him. He's not being defiant or attention-seeking. He's drowning, and no one with the power to help him is listening. I'm listening now, Rebecca said quietly. And I promise you, I won't stop until someone with authority is listening too. After Rebecca left, Mariah sat alone in the coffee shop until they closed at 9. Then she walked home through Uptown's familiar streets, past the Vietnamese restaurants and African grocery stores, and the mix of gentrification and generational community that made this neighborhood feel more real than the glass tower she'd just been ejected from. Marcus was waiting up, anxiety written across his teenage face. What happened? You lose your job? Mariah set down her backpack and pulled her brother into a hug. Yeah, baby, I lost it. But why? You're the best employee ever. You're never late, never. I helped a kid who needed help, and his father didn't like it. Marcus pulled back, studying her face. Was it the right thing to do? Yeah, it was. Then we'll figure it out. I can get a job after school. I can... No. Mariah's voice was firm. You're staying in school. You're focusing on your grades. You're getting out of here, getting into a good college, building the life Mom wanted for you. I'll find another job. We'll be okay. But that night, lying in her bed staring at the ceiling, Mariah wasn't sure they would be okay. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from the temp agency, probably calling to tell her she'd been blacklisted from their roster. The rent was due in 2 weeks, Marcus's school fees in 3. The refrigerator was running low, and somewhere across the city, in a glass tower overlooking Lake Michigan, a small boy was going to sleep wondering why the only person who'd ever heard him had walked away. Mariah pulled up the photos she'd secretly taken over the past 2 weeks. Images of Jordan's signs, videos of his attempts to communicate, screenshots of the research she'd done on experimental treatments for deaf children. She documented everything, not knowing why, just following an instinct that evidence might matter someday. Now she understood. This wasn't over. Rebecca Morrison might write her article, but articles could be buried, ignored, dismissed as speculation. What Jordan needed was something bigger, something undeniable. Mariah opened her laptop and started searching for legal aid organizations, child advocacy groups, anyone who might take on a case against a billionaire. Most of the search results were depressing, consultations that cost hundreds of dollars, attorneys who laughed at pro bono requests involving wealthy defendants, bureaucratic systems designed to protect power rather than children. But then she found it. The Children's Defense Project, a small non-profit based in Chicago's South Loop, founded by a Latina lawyer named Sofia Rodriguez, who'd made her name taking on impossible cases and occasionally winning. Their website showed an intake form for potential clients. Mariah filled it out in detail, attached her documentation, and in the section marked, "Why is this case urgent?" she wrote, "A 9-year-old deaf child is being subjected to unauthorized medical treatments by his billionaire father. The child signs, 'They're hurting me,' but is prevented from communicating. I have evidence." I signed an NDA. I don't know if that makes me useless as a witness, but someone needs to listen to this boy before it's too late. She hit submit at 2 a.m., then finally fell into exhausted sleep. Her phone woke her at 7:30 a.m. Unknown number. She answered groggily. "Mariah Carter, this is Sofia Rodriguez with the Children's Defense Project. I got your intake form. We need to talk. Today. How soon can you get to our office?" Mariah sat up, sleep evaporating. "I can be there in an hour. Make it 45 minutes, and bring everything you have, because if what you've told me is accurate, we're going to war." Sofia Rodriguez's office was nothing like the Pierce penthouse, located on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse in the South Loop. The Children's Defense Project operated out of a space that looked like organized chaos. Case files stacked on every available surface, mismatched furniture that had clearly been donated, a coffee maker that looked older than Mariah, and walls covered with photographs of children whose cases they'd won. Sofia herself was a force of nature in a 5'2" frame. Late 30s, dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a faded Northwestern law sweatshirt. Her brown eyes sharp enough to cut glass. She'd listened to Mariah's story for 90 minutes without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Now she sat back in her chair, fingers steepled, expression grim. "Okay," Sofia said. "Here's where we are. You signed an NDA, which means you can't publicly discuss the Pierce household, but, and this is important, NDAs cannot legally be used to cover up child abuse. If we can establish probable cause that Jordan is being harmed, that NDA becomes void." "Can we establish that?" Mariah asked. "Maybe. The videos you took are helpful but circumstantial. Jordan signing 'They're hurting me' is powerful evidence, but Donovan Pierce's attorneys will argue it's open to interpretation, that the child is developmentally delayed, that he doesn't understand what he's signing." Sofia pulled up a file on her laptop. "I've spent the morning researching Donovan Pierce. He's insulated, board member of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, major donor to Chicago's Museum of Contemporary Art, personal friends with half the city council. Going after him means going after the entire ecosystem that protects wealthy families from scrutiny. So we can't win." "I didn't say that." Sofia's smile was sharp. "I said it's hard. But I've built a career on hard cases. The question is whether you're ready for what this fight will cost you." Mariah met her eyes. "What will it cost?" "Your NDA violation will be discovered the moment we file anything in court. Pierce's attorneys will sue you personally for breach of contract. You could face penalties up to $1 million based on standard NDA language. They'll destroy your employment prospects, drag your character through the media, make your life hell as a warning to anyone else who might speak out." Sofia's expression softened. "I'm not trying to scare you off. I'm trying to make sure you understand the reality. Taking on Donovan Pierce means accepting that you'll lose a lot before you gain anything." Mariah thought about Jordan's face on that rooftop, thought about her grandmother's hands forming signs in the sunlight, thought about her brother Samuel, dead at 15, and all the children who'd never gotten the help they needed, because no one with the power to intervene wanted to rock the boat. "How do we start?" she asked. Sophia grinned. "That's what I was hoping you'd say. First, we need more evidence. Your documentation is good, but we need something irrefutable. Medical records, communication from Pierce's staff about the treatments, testimony from others who've witnessed what's happening to Jordan." "How do we get that?" "You know that building better than anyone. You know the rhythms, the security gaps, the routines. Is there a way to get back inside?" Mariah's pulse quickened. "You want me to break in?" "I want you to retrieve evidence that will save a child's life. What we call that is up to you." For the next 3 hours they planned. Sophia pulled up blueprints of the Pierce Tower that she'd obtained through public records. Mariah walked her through the security protocols. Cameras in the main hallways, but not the private quarters. Guards who change shifts at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. Mrs. Langford's predictable schedule. The service elevator that required a key card Mariah no longer possessed. "But I still have my building maintenance uniform in my apartment," Mariah said slowly. "The generic one from the agency. Same navy blue that all the building staff wear. And I know the maintenance crews rotate floors on a monthly schedule. They'll be on 42 this week." Sophia nodded. "So you pose as building maintenance, not Pierce household staff. You avoid the penthouse itself and target Pierce's home office. That's where he'd keep medical files, treatment records, anything we need. His office is alarmed after hours." "Is it alarmed during the day?" Mariah thought back. "No. During business hours, staff circulate freely. Donovan's usually at his downtown office on Monday mornings. That's his standing meeting day with his executive team." "So, tomorrow morning," Sophia said, "you're a building maintenance worker doing a routine air quality inspection. You have about 90 minutes during his downtown meetings before staff might notice anything unusual. Can you get in, find what we need, and get out in that time frame? If I know where to look." Sophia pulled up another document, a subpoena request she'd drafted that morning. "I'm filing this today, requesting all of Jordan's medical records from the past 3 years. Pierce's attorneys will fight it, which buys us at least a week. But if you find physical documentation in his office, dated treatment plans, invoices from practitioners, communication about unauthorized procedures, that gives us ammunition to accelerate the court process." Mariah's hands were shaking. "And if I get caught? Then you'll be arrested for trespassing, and Pierce will use that arrest to destroy your credibility as a witness. But if I succeed, then we have a real shot at getting an emergency custody evaluation. The court appoints a guardian ad litem for Jordan, someone who can actually assess what's being done to him. Once we get that guardian in the room, once Jordan can communicate directly to someone with authority, the whole house of cards collapses." Mariah stood and walked to the window. Outside, Chicago's South Loop bustled with Monday morning activity. People heading to work, to school, to wherever their regular lives took them. Normal, safe, uncomplicated. She could walk away. Take Sophia's documentation, let the attorney fight the legal battle while Mariah focused on finding another job, rebuilding her life, protecting Marcus. But then she thought about Jordan's hands signing, "Don't leave me," as security dragged her away. Some children didn't get the luxury of waiting for the legal system to maybe, eventually, possibly notice they were drowning. "I'll do it," Mariah said. "Tomorrow morning. I'll get you what you need." Monday morning arrived with autumn rain, the kind of gray Chicago drizzle that made the city feel heavy and close. Mariah stood outside the Pierce Tower at 5:45 a.m., wearing her Navy maintenance uniform, carrying a clipboard, and wearing a tool belt that Sophia had procured from a friend in building services. She looked exactly like any other maintenance worker arriving for an early shift. The lobby security guard barely glanced at her credentials. a hastily printed badge that Sophia had created using a friend's actual maintenance company. In the guard's experience, maintenance workers were invisible, beneath notice, part of the building's machinery rather than its humanity. Mariah rode the service elevator to the 42nd floor, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The penthouse was quiet at this hour. Through the glass walls, she could see the early morning light struggling through rain clouds, turning Lake Michigan the color of steel. Somewhere in the private quarters, Jordan would still be sleeping. Mrs. Langford wouldn't arrive until 7. The overnight security guard was stationed in the lobby, not on the residential floors. She had perhaps an hour before anyone noticed an unauthorized presence. Donovan Pierce's home office occupied the south corner of the penthouse, all glass and chrome and minimalist furniture that probably cost more than Mariah's annual salary. The door was locked, but Sophia had prepared for this. A lockpick set disguised as a pen, along with a 30-second tutorial video Mariah had watched approximately 50 times last night. Her hands shook as she worked the lock. The mechanism clicked after 20 seconds that felt like 20 years. Inside, the office was frigid from aggressive air conditioning and intimidating in its stark perfection. A massive desk dominated the space, its surface empty except for a single computer monitor and a geometric sculpture that might have been art or a paperweight. Behind the desk, built-in shelving held leather-bound books that looked more decorative than read. Mariah moved quickly to the filing cabinets along the east wall. They were labeled with clinical precision: legal, financial, medical, household. She pulled open the medical drawer. Inside, files were organized chronologically, each in a crisp manila folder with typed labels. She pulled out the most recent ones, her eyes scanning quickly. Jordan Pierce, Behavioral Modification Progress Report, September 2024. Auditory Sensitivity Treatment Protocol, Dr. Marcus Volkov. Authorization for Experimental Therapeutic Intervention. Mariah's hands stilled on that last one. She opened it carefully. Inside was a treatment consent form, signed by Donovan Pierce, authorizing Dr. Volkov to administer progressive auditory desensitization therapy using electromagnetic stimulation and pharmaceutical enhancement. The form outlined potential side effects: headaches, nausea, sensory disturbances, temporary cognitive disruption. Temporary cognitive disruption. Jordan's confusion, his fear, his pain, reduced to clinical language that made torture sound therapeutic. She kept reading, found invoices for weekly sessions totaling $15,000 per month, found emails from Dr. Volkov assuring Donovan that Jordan's resistance was normal and that continued intervention would produce the desired normalization. Found a particularly chilling email from Donovan himself. I appreciate your work, Marcus. Sarah would never have approved these methods, but Sarah also never accepted that our son needed fixing. Do whatever it takes. I want him functional by his 10th birthday. Mariah pulled out her phone and started photographing everything, her hands moving faster as adrenaline overrode fear. Page after page, document after document, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss. Then she heard it, the distinctive click of heels in the outer hallway. Mrs. Langford. She wasn't supposed to arrive until 7, but here she was at 6:30, probably coming early to prepare for whatever the week demanded. Mariah's mind raced. The office door was closed but not locked from the inside. If Mrs. Langford decided to check the office, decided to investigate any detail that seemed unusual. The heel clicks grew louder, moving down the hallway toward the office. Mariah looked around desperately. The desk was too exposed. The closet was too obvious. Behind the door meant being discovered the instant it opened. Her eyes found the space beneath the massive executive desk. a shadowed gap between the front panel and the back wall. She folded herself into that space, pulling her knees tight against her chest, making herself as small as possible. The files were still spread across the desk surface above her. If Mrs. Langford looked closely, she'd see them. The office door opened. Through the gap between the desk's front panel and the floor, Mariah could see Mrs. Langford's sensible black pumps entering the room. The woman walked to the window, stood there for a moment, doing what? Mariah had no idea. Then turned back toward the desk. The shoes stopped directly in front of Mariah's hiding place. She held her breath, pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle even the sound of her breathing. Above her, she heard papers rustling. Mrs. Langford had seen the files. What on earth? The woman's voice was tight with suspicion. More rustling. Then footsteps moving quickly toward the door. Mrs. Langford was leaving, to alert security, to check the cameras, to investigate. The office door closed. Mariah gave herself 10 seconds, then scrambled out from under the desk. She couldn't take the files. Mrs. Langford had seen them, would notice if they disappeared, but she had photos. That would have to be enough. She moved toward the door, pressed her ear against it. Heard voices in the distance. Mrs. Langford speaking urgently to someone on the phone. The penthouse had 2 exits, the main elevator and the service stairs. If security was being called, they'd lock down the elevator first. The stairs were her only chance. Mariah slipped out of the office and moved quickly toward the west wing, toward the door marked "Exit" in glowing letters. Behind her she heard the elevator chiming its arrival, heard multiple voices entering the penthouse. She pushed through the stairwell door and started descending, taking steps 2 at a time, her shoes echoing in the concrete shaft. 42 floors to ground level, if security caught her in the stairwell. She was trapped. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sophia. "Get out now! Police scanner shows units headed to your location." Mariah ran faster, her lungs burning, her legs screaming. 25th floor. 20th. 15th. At the 10th floor, she heard voices above her. Security entering the stairwell from the penthouse level. "Stop! Building security!" She kept running. 5th floor. 3rd. 2nd. The ground floor exit burst open and she flew through it, straight into the service corridor that ran behind the building's lobby. Rain hit her face as she pushed through the exterior door into the alley, into the gray Chicago morning, into the uncertain safety of crowds and traffic, and the anonymity of a city too big to track every fugitive. She ran for 3 blocks before allowing herself to slow to a walk, blending into the Monday morning commuters heading to work in the loop. Her phone showed 6 missed calls from Sophia. She answered as she walked. "I'm out. I got photos. Lots of them." "Thank God." Sophia's voice was shaky with relief. "Get to the office immediately. We need to move fast. If they've identified you, Pierce's attorneys will file for a restraining order before noon." Mariah hung up and kept walking, her maintenance uniform soaked with rain and sweat, her hands still shaking, the phone containing evidence of child abuse pressed tight against her chest. Behind her, somewhere in that glass tower, a small boy was waking up to another day of suffering. But this time, someone was finally listening, and the truth, once documented, couldn't be locked away forever. The photographs changed everything. By Tuesday morning, Sophia had filed an emergency motion for a guardian ad litem appointment, attaching Mariah's documentation as exhibits. By Tuesday afternoon, Donovan Pierce's legal team had filed a counter-motion to dismiss, along with a restraining order against Mariah for violating her NDA and trespassing on private property. By Wednesday morning, Rebecca Morrison's article dropped in the Chicago Tribune. The headline read, "Silence isn't golden. Are wealthy parents subjecting deaf children to harmful treatments?" The article didn't name Jordan Pierce explicitly, Morrison was too smart for that. But it quoted extensively from deaf community advocates who described patterns they'd witnessed. Hearing parents with unlimited resources pursuing experimental treatments, behavioral modification programs that traumatized children, systematic isolation from deaf culture and ASL, and it included the rooftop video, faces blurred, showing an unnamed child signing "They're hurting me" while being physically removed from an event. The article went viral by noon. #listen to deaf children trended on Twitter. Disability rights organizations demanded investigations. The Illinois Department of Children and Family Services received hundreds of calls. And that's when Donovan Pierce made his fatal mistake. Instead of staying silent, instead of letting his attorneys handle the crisis, he held a press conference. It took place Thursday morning at the Park Hyatt's Grand Ballroom. Donovan, in a perfectly tailored suit, his PR team flanking him, 24 cameras capturing every word. "These allegations against my household are categorically false," he began, his voice steady and authoritative. "My son Jordan receives the finest care available. Every treatment has been approved by licensed medical professionals. Every intervention has been designed to help him overcome challenges and reach his full potential." A reporter shouted from the back, "Mr. Pierce, is your son deaf?" "My son has auditory processing issues that we're addressing through therapeutic intervention." "Does he use sign language?" Donovan's jaw tightened. His late mother introduced him to signing, yes, but we've moved beyond that approach. Jordan is learning to communicate verbally, to integrate fully into the hearing world rather than retreating into isolation. Another reporter. The Tribune article quotes deaf advocates who say forced assimilation is harmful. How do you respond? I respond by pointing out that I'm Jordan's father. I know what's best for my son. Not activists with political agendas, not former staff members with axes to grind, not journalists looking for sensational stories. Are you referring to Mariah Carter, the woman who was filmed helping your son during his episode at your fundraiser? Ms. Carter violated her employment agreement, trespassed on my property, and stole confidential medical documentation. She's currently facing legal consequences for those actions. The room erupted with questions, but Donovan held up his hand. I'm hosting a charity gala tomorrow evening at the Millennium Park Pavilion. Chicago's annual Innovation Awards. 200 of the city's technology and business leaders will be there. Jordan will be attending with me. You're all welcome to see firsthand how well-adjusted and happy he is. Thank you. He walked off before the reporters could follow up, leaving behind a room full of frustrated journalists and a PR disaster that his team was already scrambling to contain. Sophia called Mariah within minutes of the press conference ending. "Did you watch?" "Every second," Mariah said. She was sitting in Sophia's office, where she'd been essentially living for the past 3 days, afraid to return to her apartment given the restraining order. "He just gave us an opening," Sophia said. "If he's bringing Jordan to a public event tomorrow, that's our chance." The court's guardian ad litem. Judge Martinez appointed her yesterday. She'll be there. We'll be there. And more importantly, Jordan will have an opportunity to communicate in front of witnesses. He won't sign in front of his father. He might, if he knows he's being listened to, if he sees you there, if he understands that someone is finally fighting for him. Mariah's stomach churned. "I have a restraining order. I'm not allowed within 500 feet of Donovan or Jordan Pierce." The restraining order specifies private locations and residence. It doesn't specify public events. My reading, and I'm a lawyer, so my reading matters, is that you're legally permitted to attend a public charity gala. Pierce's attorneys will call the police the second they see me. Probably. But by then, Jordan will have had a chance to communicate with the guardian ad litem. That's all we need. 5 minutes of unfiltered truth. Sophia pulled up a file on her laptop. I've been in contact with Emily Zhao, the guardian ad litem. She's a fierce advocate, worked in juvenile court for 15 years. She knows ASL. I made sure of it. If Jordan signs to her, she'll understand. And her report to the judge will be what determines whether Child Protective Services gets involved. And if Jordan won't sign, if he's too scared, then we're back to fighting this in court with just documentation, which we can do. Your photographs are damning, but nothing is more powerful than hearing directly from the child. Mariah closed her eyes, thought about Jordan's face, his hands desperately forming words no one acknowledged. Thought about her grandmother's voice saying, "Never stop listening, even when the world does." "I'll be there," she said, "whatever it takes." Friday evening arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made Chicago's reputation, crisp and clear, the skyline glittering against a deepening blue sky. Millennium Park's Pritzker Pavilion was dressed for elegance, with the great steel architecture framing an outdoor gala designed to showcase Chicago's tech innovation while raising money for STEM education programs. Mariah arrived wearing a borrowed dress from Sophia's closet, her natural hair styled by Marcus, who'd watched 3 YouTube tutorials and surprised them both with his skills. She didn't look like a maid anymore. She looked like someone who belonged at a charity gala, which was the whole point. Sophia arrived separately, dressed professionally but not ostentatiously, playing the role of attorney attending as an interested member of the legal community. Emily Zhao, the guardian ad litem, was already there, positioned near the pavilion entrance, watching guests arrive. And then came Donovan Pierce. He emerged from a black SUV with Jordan beside him, the boy dressed in a miniature version of his father's tailored suit. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Donovan smiled and waved, his hand firmly on Jordan's shoulder, in a gesture that could have been protective or possessive depending on your interpretation. Jordan looked small and terrified, his eyes downcast, his hands clasped rigidly in front of him. Mariah felt her heart crack. They moved through the security checkpoint and into the gala space. Mariah followed from a distance, careful to stay beyond the 500-foot restraining order limit until Jordan was inside. Then, technically, the private residence restriction no longer applied. The gala was beautiful. String lights overhead, tables arranged around the pavilion, a stage set for presentations and speeches. Chicago's elite mingled with drinks and appetizers while a jazz quartet played softly. Mariah spotted Emily Zhao moving strategically closer to where Donovan had positioned himself and Jordan. The guardian ad litem looked casual, just another guest, but her eyes were laser-focused on the small boy who stood silent beside his father. Then someone recognized Mariah. "That's her!" A voice from the crowd. Mrs. Langford standing near the bar, her face contorting with fury. "That's the woman who trespassed. Security!" Heads turned. Conversations stopped. Donovan Pierce's expression transformed from polite host to volcanic rage in half a second. "Get her out!" he commanded the security guards moving toward Mariah. "She has a restraining order. She's not supposed to be here." "The restraining order doesn't specify public events," Sophia said loudly, materializing beside Mariah. "My client has every right to attend a public charity gala. If you remove her forcibly, we'll add harassment charges to our growing list of legal actions against you, Mr. Pierce." The security guards hesitated, caught between commands, and in that moment of chaos, Jordan looked up and saw Mariah. His entire face transformed. Hope flooded his features like sunrise. His hands moved before he could stop himself, signing frantically. "You came back. You came back." Every camera in the vicinity swung toward him. Every phone started recording. "Jordan, stop that!" Donovan hissed, grabbing his son's hands and forcing them down. But Jordan twisted away, desperate, his signs becoming larger, clearer, impossible to ignore. She sees me. She hears me. You don't listen. Stop making a scene, Donovan commanded, his voice low and dangerous. I'm not seen, Jordan signed wildly, his incomplete ASL mixing with home signs and raw emotion. I'm person. I'm here. I'm hurt. Listen to me. Listen. Emily Zhao moved forward smoothly, positioning herself directly in front of Jordan. She knelt down to his eye level and signed with perfect clarity. Jordan, I'm Emily. I work for the court. I understand sign language. Can you tell me what's happening? Jordan's eyes widened. He looked from Emily to Mariah to his father. And Mariah could see the calculation happening, the weighing of fear against hope, silence against voice. Then Jordan took a breath and started signing. What poured out was 3 years of suffering. He signed about his mother's death, about the language being taken away, about the doctors his father brought who did things that hurt. He signed about Tuesdays, about machines on his head, about medicine that made the world fuzzy and wrong. He signed about isolation, about staff who looked through him like glass, about wanting to scream but having no voice they'd recognize. He signed about Mariah, about seeing her and thinking maybe, finally, someone could hear him, about begging her not to leave, about losing hope when she did. And then he signed the most damning thing of all. Dad says he's fixing me, but I'm not broken. I'm deaf. And that's okay, but he won't let me be deaf. He wants me to be someone else, anyone else. Not me. The entire gala had gone silent. 200 of Chicago's most powerful people stood frozen, watching a 9-year-old child testify in a language most of them didn't understand, but could feel in their bones. Emily Zhao continued signing, asking careful questions, clarifying details, while filming everything on her phone with her other hand. This would be her report to the judge, unfiltered, undeniable, straight from the child's own hands. Donovan Pierce's face had gone ashen. He reached for Jordan's shoulder, but Emily smoothly blocked him. Mr. Pierce, I'm conducting an emergency evaluation under court order. Please step back. That's my son. That's a child in distress who is reporting potential abuse. I'm legally obligated to conduct this assessment without parental interference. Step back. For the first time in his adult life, Donovan Pierce had no control, no authority, no ability to manage the situation through lawyers or money or force of will. He stood helpless while his son's truth poured out in signs his hands had been trying to hide for years. Mariah watched through tears, her heart breaking and healing simultaneously. Jordan signed until his hands were tired, until Emily had asked every question, until there was nothing left unsaid. Then he looked at Mariah across the space between them and signed one final phrase. Thank you for hearing me. The police arrived shortly after, not to arrest Mariah, as Pierce's security had demanded, but to escort Donovan for questioning. Child Protective Services had been called. An emergency protective custody order had been issued. Jordan would be staying with a trained foster family while the investigation proceeded. As the officers led Donovan away, he looked back at his son with an expression that might have been regret or might have been anger. Jordan didn't return the gaze. He was holding Emily Zhao's hand, signing questions about where he'd go, whether he'd be safe, whether anyone would hurt him again. Emily signed back with patience and kindness. You're safe now, I promise. And wherever you go, you'll be allowed to sign. No one will take your language away again. The gala dispersed in shocked silence. Tomorrow this would be front-page news. Tomorrow Donovan Pierce's empire would begin its collapse. Tomorrow, the questions about wealth and power, and the children who suffer behind closed doors, would finally be asked in voices too loud to ignore. But tonight, Mariah stood in Millennium Park watching a small boy finally be heard, and she thought about her grandmother's hands forming signs in sunlight, about her brother Samuel's smile when someone understood him, about every child who'd ever been told their way of being in the world was wrong. Sophia appeared beside her, squeezing her shoulder. "You did it." "We did it," Mariah corrected. "Fair enough. Though you should know, Pierce's attorneys will still come after you for the NDA violation. This isn't over." "Let them come," Mariah said quietly. "Some voices are worth fighting for." The media storm that followed the Millennium Park Gala was unprecedented. By Saturday morning, every major news outlet had picked up the story. The video of Jordan signing his testimony, translated by ASL experts who provided subtitles, went viral across every platform. #Listen to Jordan trended globally. Disability rights organizations issued statements. The Illinois Department of Children and Family Services launched a formal investigation. And Dr. Marcus Volkoff's experimental treatment center was raided by state medical authorities. Donovan Pierce disappeared from public view, holed up in his penthouse with a crisis management team and attorneys who charged hourly rates that could fund small villages. Jordan stayed with Emily Zhao's carefully selected foster family, a deaf couple in Hyde Park named Robert and Michelle Kendricks, who'd raised 3 deaf children and ran a community center for deaf youth. For the first time in 3 years, Jordan woke up to hands that signed "Good morning," to a home where ASL was the primary language, to people who didn't treat his deafness as a problem requiring a solution. Mariah watched this unfold from Sophia's office, where she'd essentially taken up residence given that her uptown apartment had been descended upon by reporters. Marcus had temporarily moved in with a school friend, frustrated, but understanding that his sister had become an unwilling public figure. The legal battles multiplied daily. Pierce's attorneys filed a civil suit against Mariah for $2 million in damages for NDA violation and theft of confidential documents. Sophia countered with a defense that the NDA was void due to its use in covering up child abuse, and the judge agreed to hear both arguments in an expedited hearing scheduled for the following month. Then the former nannies started coming forward. First came Patricia Montgomery, who'd worked for the Pierce household for 6 weeks 2 years ago. She gave an interview to NPR describing the terrifying behavioral protocols she'd been instructed to enforce, forcing Jordan to sit in silence for hours until he attempted verbal communication, withholding meals until he used his words, isolating him in his room whenever he signed. "I quit because I couldn't participate in what felt like torture," Patricia said, her voice shaking. "Mr. Pierce told me I was soft, that Jordan needed discipline, but that child wasn't being defiant. He was drowning. And I'll regret for the rest of my life that I didn't report what I saw." Then came 3 more former nannies with similar stories. Then a housekeeper who'd been fired for inappropriate emotional attachment after she tried to learn basic signs to communicate with Jordan. Then a tutor who'd lasted 1 day after witnessing Dr. Volkoff's treatment session. Each testimony added another crack to the wall Donovan Pierce had built around his son's suffering. Meanwhile, the medical investigation revealed that Dr. Volkoff had been operating without proper licensing for his experimental treatments. His electromagnetic auditory stimulation therapy had never been approved by the FDA. His medications were off-label cocktails with dangerous side effects. His entire practice existed in the gray area where wealth meets unethical medicine, where desperate parents with unlimited funds meet practitioners willing to try anything for the right price. Dr. Volkoff's license was suspended pending a formal hearing. Criminal charges were being considered. And then, 3 weeks after the Millennium Park Gala, something unexpected happened. Donovan Pierce requested a meeting with Mariah. Sophia delivered the message during a strategy session in her office. "His attorneys contacted me. Pierce wants to meet with you personally. No lawyers present, no recordings, just the 2 of you." "Absolutely not," Marcus said immediately. He'd become a fixture at Sophia's office, protective of his sister and suspicious of anyone associated with the Pierce family. Mariah considered. What does he want? To apologize, according to his attorneys, to understand what he did wrong, to ask for your help learning to communicate with his son. It's a trap, Marcus insisted. He's going to try to manipulate you or intimidate you or, Sophia interrupted gently. He's a broken man who finally realizes he destroyed his son in the name of helping him. People do change, Marcus. Not always, not even often, but sometimes. Mariah looked out Sophia's window at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere in that forest of buildings, Donovan Pierce sat in his empty penthouse, his empire crumbling, his son removed from his custody, his legacy transformed from tech visionary to cautionary tale. I'll meet him, she said quietly, but in a public place, and with you nearby, just in case. The meeting took place at Café Umbria in the South Loop, a coffee shop with large windows and constant foot traffic, public enough to feel safe, quiet enough to have a real conversation. Sophia sat at a corner table with her laptop, ostensibly working, actually watching everything. Donovan Pierce arrived looking like he'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. His usual polish had degraded, rumpled shirt, dark circles under his eyes, hair uncombed. He spotted Mariah at a table near the window and approached slowly, like a man walking to his own execution. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said, his voice hoarse. "Sit down, Mr. Pierce." He sat, his hands clasped on the table between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Donovan broke the silence. "I've watched the video of Jordan signing at the gala approximately 500 times. Every time, I understand more of what he's saying. Every time, I realize how profoundly I failed him." Mariah said nothing, just waited. "Sarah tried to tell me," he continued, his voice breaking. "Before she died, she begged me to promise I'd keep Jordan connected to the deaf community, that I'd let him be deaf, that I'd learn to sign fluently instead of expecting him to learn to be hearing. And I promised. I looked at my dying wife and promised." Tears ran down his face, unchecked. "But after she was gone, all I could think about was how he'd struggle. How the world wasn't built for deaf people. How much easier his life would be if I could just fix him, make him normal, give him every advantage." He laughed bitterly. "I spent millions trying to fix a child who wasn't broken. I subjected him to treatments that traumatized him. I isolated him from the community that would have embraced him. I fired every person who tried to help him. And I did it all believing I was being a good father." "You weren't," Mariah said flatly. "I know." Donovan met her eyes. "I know that now. The question is whether it's too late to learn. Whether I can become the father Jordan needs instead of the father I thought I should be." "Why are you asking me?" "Because you're the only person who broke through. You saw him when everyone else looked through him. You risked everything to give him a voice. His voice caught. "I need to understand how you did that. How you saw what I couldn't see. How I can learn to listen to my own son." Mariah was quiet for a long time, watching this powerful man break down in a coffee shop, stripped of his authority and confronting his failures. Finally, she spoke. "You start by learning ASL, not just a few signs. Fluent ASL. You immerse yourself in deaf culture. You read books by deaf authors. You join deaf community events. You accept that Jordan's deafness isn't a disability to overcome. It's part of who he is, like his brown eyes or his quick mind or his love of building things." Donovan nodded. pulling out a notebook and writing frantically. "You apologize to him," Mariah continued. "Not with words. He's had enough of hearing people's words. You apologize in ASL, clearly and directly, and you accept that he might not forgive you immediately or ever. You accept that you'll spend years rebuilding trust you destroyed in your arrogance." "I will," Donovan said. "I'll do whatever it takes." "And you support organizations that help deaf children. Not with your name attached. Not for publicity. Support them quietly, consistently, in ways that actually help kids like Jordan, instead of trying to change them. You fund ASL programs in schools. You hire deaf employees in your companies. You use your resources to make the world more accessible, instead of trying to make deaf children more normal." Donovan wrote everything down, his hand shaking. When he finished, he looked up at Mariah with red-rimmed eyes. "Will you teach me?" he asked quietly. "I'm not asking you to come back as staff. I'm asking you, as someone who understands what Jordan needs, will you teach me how to be his father?" Mariah considered. Part of her wanted to refuse, to let this man suffer the consequences of his actions without offering any pathway back. But she thought about Jordan, about the small boy who still loved his father despite everything, who in his testimony at the gala had signed not just about the hurt, but about wanting his dad to see me like Mom did. "I'll connect you with the Kendricks family," she said finally. "Robert and Michelle, Jordan's foster parents. They run programs for hearing families learning to support deaf children. That's where you should start. Learn from people who've lived this, who understand it from the inside." She leaned forward, her voice firm. "But understand this, Mr. Pierce. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for Jordan, because every child deserves a parent who actually sees them. And if there's even a chance you can become that parent, Jordan deserves to have his father in his life." "Thank you," Donovan whispered. "I don't deserve your help, but thank you." He left shortly after, walking out into the Chicago afternoon, like a man beginning a very long journey. Sophia appeared at Mariah's table. "Think he means it?" "I think he's destroyed enough that maybe he can rebuild into something better. But time will tell." Over the next several months, the story continued to unfold. Dr. Volkov was charged with multiple counts of practicing medicine without proper licensing and child endangerment. His trial was scheduled for the following spring. Donovan Pierce settled Mariah's lawsuit out of court. $500,000 in damages, a public apology, and funding for a scholarship program for deaf students in her name. Mariah used the money to pay off her mother's medical debts, secure Marcus's college fund, and donate the rest to deaf advocacy organizations. The Pierce Corporation's board of directors quietly asked Donovan to step down as CEO. He complied without fighting, focusing instead on his twice-weekly supervised visits with Jordan, visits where he slowly, painfully, rebuilt a relationship using signs instead of words, presence instead of control. Jordan thrived with the Kendricks family. He started at a school for the deaf, made friends who signed fluently, joined a youth theater program that performed in ASL. He smiled more in 3 months than he had in 3 years. And then, on a cold December evening, Mariah received a message from Emily Zhao. "Jordan wants to see you. Would you visit tomorrow?" The Kendricks' home in Hyde Park was warm and welcoming, lived-in furniture, walls covered with family photos, a kitchen that smelled of baking. Michelle Kendricks answered the door and signed a greeting before ushering Mariah into the living room. Jordan was sitting on the floor building an elaborate Lego structure. When he saw Mariah, his entire face lit up. "You came!" he signed excitedly, jumping up. "Of course I came," Mariah signed back, kneeling to hug him. They sat together on the couch, Jordan chattering in confident ASL about school, about his new friends, about the play he was rehearsing. His signing had improved dramatically, fluid and expressive, no more fragmented gestures. Then he grew serious. "I have something to show you." He pulled out a notebook and opened it to a page filled with careful handwriting. At the top, in large letters, "My Story," by Jordan Pierce. "I'm writing about what happened," he signed. "Mrs. Emily says my story might help other kids. Kids who feel like no one can hear them." Mariah's throat tightened. "That's beautiful, Jordan. But I wanted to ask you." He paused, choosing his signs carefully. "Can I write about you? About how you came back? How you listened even when it was hard? You can write whatever feels true to you." Jordan nodded thoughtfully. Then he signed something that would stay with Mariah forever. "I used to think I was broken because no one could understand me. But I wasn't broken. They were just speaking the wrong language. You taught me that listening isn't about ears. It's about caring enough to learn someone else's words." 6 months later, on a bright June morning, Mariah stood on the steps of a converted Victorian mansion in Lincoln Park, watching workers install a sign above the entrance: "The Sarah Pierce Institute for Deaf Empowerment and Family Support." Donovan Pierce stood beside her, significantly humbler than the man she'd first encountered in that glass tower. He signed slowly, his ASL still imperfect but improving. "Do you think Sarah would be proud?" Mariah considered. "I think Sarah would be proud of Jordan. The Institute is just a beginning." The Sarah Pierce Institute had been Donovan's idea, built from his genuine desire to turn his personal failure into something that might prevent other families from making the same mistakes. He'd funded it entirely, then immediately stepped back from leadership, instead assembling a board composed entirely of deaf adults and parents of deaf children who'd successfully navigated the journey he'd failed so catastrophically. The Institute would offer free ASL classes for hearing families, support groups for parents struggling with their children's diagnosis, advocacy resources for fighting for accessibility in schools and workplaces, and most importantly, a community center where deaf children and adults could gather, connect, and know they belonged. Michelle Kendricks had been hired as executive director. Robert would run the youth programs. And Mariah, after extensive discussion with Sophia about what she actually wanted to do with her life, had accepted a position as family outreach coordinator. "You're sure about this?" Sophia had asked when Mariah first mentioned the job offer. "You could do anything now. The publicity from this case, your story, you could write a book, give speeches, make real money." "I don't want publicity," Mariah had said. "I want to do what my grandmother did, be a bridge, help families learn to actually see and hear their deaf children. That's worth more than any amount of money." Now, watching the sign go up, watching the sun illuminate the words, Mariah felt a deep sense of rightness. This was where she was supposed to be. Jordan arrived with the Kendricks family shortly before the grand opening ceremony. He'd grown taller in 6 months, his face less haunted, his movements more confident. He wore a T-shirt that said "Deaf Pride" in rainbow letters, and signed enthusiastically to Michelle about something that had happened at school. When he spotted Mariah, he ran over and hugged her tightly. "This place is amazing," he signed. "I get to help teach ASL to kids whose parents are learning." "You'll be an excellent teacher," Mariah signed back. "And Dad—" Jordan paused, his signs becoming more careful. "Dad comes to ASL class 3 times a week now. He's not good yet, but he tries. He asked me to help him practice." "How do you feel about that?" Jordan thought for a moment. "I don't trust him yet. Not completely. But I think maybe someday I will. He's different now. He actually looks at me when I sign. He doesn't try to fix me anymore. That's good, Jordan. Really good. The ceremony began at 10. Over 200 people gathered in the Institute's main hall, deaf and hearing mixed together, conversations happening in both ASL and English, interpreters moving seamlessly between groups. This was what inclusion actually looked like. Donovan gave a short speech, signing alongside speaking, his imperfect ASL interpreted by a professional to ensure accuracy. My late wife Sarah believed that every child deserves to be seen, heard, and accepted exactly as they are. I failed to honor that belief after she passed. I hurt my son trying to help him. I isolated him trying to protect him. And in my arrogance, I almost destroyed the most precious thing in my life. He paused, his emotions evident. This institute exists because my son is stronger than I ever was, because a housekeeper cared more about his well-being than her job security, and because the deaf community opened their arms to a boy I'd tried to erase from their world. I will spend the rest of my life working to be worthy of their forgiveness. Jordan stood with the Kendricks family, signing to Robert. He's trying. Robert signed back. That's all anyone can do. Keep trying to be better. After Donovan, several deaf adults spoke about their experiences, their stories ranging from painful to hopeful to triumphant. Then, Michelle Kendricks introduced Mariah. Our final speaker today is Mariah Carter, who risked everything to ensure one child's voice was finally heard. Mariah joins us as the Institute's Family Outreach Coordinator, and we're honored to have her vision and heart as part of our team. Mariah stepped to the front, feeling suddenly nervous in front of so many people. She'd prepared remarks, but now they felt inadequate. So instead, she signed from the heart. My grandmother was deaf. She taught me that listening isn't about ears. It's about presence. About caring enough to learn someone else's language. About understanding that different doesn't mean less. I learned ASL not because I had to, but because I loved her. And that love opened up an entire world I never would have known otherwise. She paused, finding Jordan in the crowd. He smiled encouragingly. When I met Jordan, I saw my grandmother's hands in his. I saw a child desperately trying to communicate in a language no one had bothered to learn. And I realized that if I walked away, if I kept my head down and focused on my own survival, I'd be just as guilty as everyone else who'd looked through him instead of at him. I'm not a hero. I just did what anyone should do when they see a child suffering. I listened. I acted. I refused to accept that silence was the answer. This institute exists because children like Jordan deserve families who meet them where they are. Because deaf children aren't broken hearing children. They're whole, complete, perfect, exactly as they are. Because every child has a voice, and our job as adults is to learn how to listen. The room erupted in applause, some clapping, many waving their hands in the deaf applause, creating a visual symphony of approval. After the ceremony, people mingled in the Institute's community room, eating catered food and exploring the various program spaces. Mariah found herself surrounded by parents of deaf children, all with variations of the same desperate question. How do we connect with our child? How do we learn to really see them? She answered patiently, exchanging contact information, recommending resources, offering the kind of hope that comes from knowing the bridge can be built. Marcus appeared with a plate of cookies, grinning. My sister, the famous advocate. Who knew? Shut up, Mariah laughed, grabbing a cookie. How's Northwestern treating you? Her brother had started college in January on a full scholarship, studying social work with a focus on family services. Their mother would have been proud. It's good. Hard, but good. I'm thinking about specializing in working with families of deaf children, actually. Seems like there's a need. You think? Mariah smiled. They stood together watching the crowd, hearing and deaf mixing seamlessly, conversations happening in multiple languages, barriers dissolving through the simple act of people choosing to understand one another. Jordan approached them, signing to Mariah. "Can I show you something?" She followed him upstairs to the Institute's library, a sunny room filled with books in both English and ASL literature, with large windows overlooking the tree-lined street. Jordan pulled out his notebook, the one he'd been writing his story in. It was substantially thicker now. "I finished," he signed. "Mrs. Emily is helping me turn it into a real book. They're going to publish it for other deaf kids to read." "Jordan, that's incredible." He turned to a page near the end and showed her a section that made her eyes burn with tears. "I used to think being deaf meant being alone. But then Mariah taught me that being alone and being unheard are different things. You can be surrounded by people and still be alone if no one knows your language. But you can be deaf in a hearing world and never be alone, as long as someone cares enough to learn how you speak. Mariah learned my language when she didn't have to. She risked everything when she didn't have to. She fought for me when she didn't have to. And because she did, I learned the most important lesson of my life. My voice matters. Not because I learned to talk the way hearing people wanted, but because I learned that signing is talking. That my hands have as much power as anyone's voice. That I don't need to change to be worthy of being heard." Below the text, Jordan had drawn a picture, two hands signing, "I see you," surrounded by stars. Mariah pulled him into a hug, unable to sign through her tears. When they finally pulled apart, Jordan signed, "Thank you for hearing me. Thank you for teaching everyone else to hear me too. Thank you for making me believe I mattered. You always mattered, Jordan. Always." They sat together in the library for a while, watching through the window as more families arrived at the Institute, as the community grew, as the work of building bridges between hearing and deaf worlds continued. Later, as the sun began to set over Lincoln Park and the opening day crowds began to thin, Mariah found herself alone in the main hall. She walked slowly through the space, touching the walls, imagining all the families who would come through these doors seeking help, seeking hope, seeking connection. Her phone buzzed. A text from Sophia. "Saw the news coverage. You did good, Carter. Really good." Mariah smiled and put her phone away. Through the window, she could see Jordan playing with other deaf children in the Institute's garden, his hands flying through rapid-fire signs, his laugh visible if not audible. She thought about her grandmother, about all the lessons learned in a small Atlanta kitchen, about her brother Samuel, gone too soon but never forgotten, about every child who'd ever felt invisible, unheard, erased. And she thought about the simple truth that had started all of this. Every child has a voice. You just have to care enough to learn how to listen. The Sarah Pierce Institute for Deaf Empowerment and Family Support opened its doors that June day, and it would go on to serve thousands of families over the years to come. Its programs would be replicated in other cities. Its model would influence policy. Its existence would prove that when people choose understanding over fear, connection over isolation, acceptance over control, impossible things become possible. But none of that would matter as much as the individual moments. The parent who finally signs "I love you" correctly, the child who realizes they're not alone, the family who learns that different is just different, not less. Those moments, multiplied across days and years and lives, were the real victory. And it all started because one woman refused to walk away from a child drowning in silence, because she chose to listen when the world insisted there was nothing to hear. The truth had always been simple. Every child has a voice. Sometimes you just have to learn how to listen.